Hello, my name is Rachel, and I'm a sound designer for games. Today, we'll be taking a look at how I added Footsteps to the StackObot sample game. I made two separate versions, one using Unreal Audio and one using Wwise, to practice using both workflows. We'll look at the version using Unreal Audio first, and we'll also take a look at how the surface detection system was set up. The first thing I did was add audio components to the feet of the player character. I created new sockets on the left and right feet bones to attach the components to, so that the components could move correctly with the feet during animations. For my first pass, I followed a tutorial that would play the footstep sound when the foot was at a certain angle. I liked the idea of not having to hand tag every animation, but then I realized I would need to add exceptions for all of the jumping and falling animations. Since I only had one character, it was faster for me to just add in the anim notifies than to figure out how to get the exceptions to work. The project had a few of the animations tagged by default, so I adjusted the timings of the ones that already existed, and for the jump, I had the sound cue play directly from the animation rather than using an anim notify. The next step was to figure out what surface types the player would be walking on. I did a quick fly-through of the world to see what all the different platforms looked like, and came up with the list on the left. Looking through the materials list, I wanted to make sure I was only tagging the ones the player would walk on. So I clicked on all the different surfaces to see what materials they were using and assigned a surface type to each material. I added physical surfaces in the project settings to match the surface types I had identified, created matching physical materials, and then assigned the physical materials based on the list I had made. One thing I realized while doing this was that the foliage was an additional layer on each surface. We'll come back to this later. Now that I knew what my different surface materials were, I made a base meta sound that I turned into a preset to use for all of the different footsteps. Each surface type has its own footstep meta sound. The meta sound includes randomization for the pitch, volume, and what file plays. Since the foliage is an additional layer to the surface types, I also included a section that adds a foliage footstep layer, with a variable that controls the volume of that layer. Using a preset for these ended up being extremely helpful as I made smaller adjustments to how the meta sound played back in game, since any change I made would affect all four surface types at once. All of the surface detection happens from within the animation blueprint for the player character. We start by getting references to the feet audio components to use later. All of the surface detection happens in the functions down here, which are triggered by the anim notifies we saw earlier. Let's take a look at the function now. To detect the different surface types, I used a line trace. If the line trace detects a new physical material, it will send it to a select node that will then choose the appropriate meta sound to be set on each of the feet audio components. Getting the foliage layer to work took a bit more time. For this, I used a narrow sphere trace around the feet of the player character to be able to detect any collision with foliage. If the sphere trace detects any foliage, it will change the variable in the footstep meta sound that controls the volume of the foliage layer. I added custom collision settings to the different foliage meshes in the content browser, but realized that the sphere trace still wasn't detecting anything. It turns out all of the foliage was being procedurally placed in the world through the use of procedural node graphs, and any procedurally generated version of the foliage had completely different collision settings from the default meshes. To fix this, I went into all of the PCG graphs that involve foliage and added the collision settings there, then regenerated all the maps. Once I did this, the sphere trace worked, and the foliage layer started to turn on and off the way it should. While the footsteps were the main focus of the project, I also made some small edits to the jump and jetpack sounds as well. I made a simple sound cue for the jump to add a bit of variation to it, and added some pitch variation and a longer fade out to the loop of the jetpack. Here's what the final version ended up sounding like. So now that we have everything up and running, how would we approach this if we wanted to use Wwise? First things first, I set up a super basic structure in Wwise. I used separate switch containers for the surface types and the foliage, and then combined them both into one event. I also created some additional random containers and matching events for the jetpack and jump as well. Because of how few events there were, I decided to use auto-generated sound banks to keep things simple. From there, the next step was to swap out a few elements of our current setup to work with Wwise. I replaced the audio components on the player character with AK components, and then swapped out the notifies on the jump to play a Wwise event instead. I also replaced the meta sounds being played on the jetpack with Wwise events as well. The data that we're getting from the line trace is still applicable for our switch containers, but instead of setting a meta sound, I had the select node update the surface switch instead. The sphere trace for the foliage now updates the foliage switch for the footstep events. This is how it sounds in-game. And that's it for the footsteps. Thanks so much for watching.